London society ran on two fuels, cruelty and silk. Everyone knew the rules, even if no one sent them aloud. Punch down, kiss up, and whatever happens, never make a scene. Beatrice Hastings knew the rules well. She had never found a good enough reason to obey them. When she stepped between a vicious social climbing debutante and a strange old woman in a crowded dress shop on a Tuesday afternoon, she believed she was doing nothing more than sparing a pensioner an unpleasant quarter of an hour. She had no notion that she was auditioning, by accident, for the most terrifying role in England, daughter-in-law to a duke. The air inside Madame Valerius's shop was thick with hot dust, crushed flowers, and ambition. It was the height of the London season, when the city's finest crowded into badly ventilated rooms to weigh one another's worth by the width of a ribbon. Beatrice stood near the back, nursing a low headache. At 26, she had been filed away by the ton under a single tidy label, spinster. She wore the word like an old, comfortable coat, no longer fashionable, but it kept out the cold. It bought her a kind of invisibility. No one troubled to look twice at a woman with a modest dowry and watchful eyes. They looked straight past her, toward the 19-year-old heiresses fluttering by the imported French silks.
She ran a gloved thumb over a bolt of dark green velvet, beautiful but far too heavy for a summer gown, and let her attention drift, because that was what she did in rooms like this. She watched. Her younger sister Louisa was hidden behind a dressing screen, agonizing over the drape of a muslin bodice, which left Beatrice free to observe the shop's small, cruel ecosystem from the shadows she preferred. Near the front window, where the afternoon light caught every strand of gold, stood Miss Harriet Finch. Harriet was 19, possessed of a dowry large enough to purchase a modest island, and blessed with a voice like a silver spoon scraped hard against porcelain. "I will not have it in blue," Harriet announced to the shop at large, her tone cutting clean through the low hum of rustling fabric. "Blue is for country girls and second daughters. I require the gold. The Duke of Ashbourne returns to town this week, and I am reliably informed he favors gold." Beatrice suppressed a sigh. The Duke of Ashbourne. Leopold, notoriously reclusive, famously wealthy, and thoroughly sick of the marriage mart, if the rumors could be believed. Every ambitious mother in Mayfair was currently treating his return like the opening of a military campaign. She let Harriet's demands fade into background noise and turned instead toward the table of discarded remnants near the counter. Offcuts, ribbon ends, bruised silk flowers Madame Valerius left out, ostensibly for inspiration. A small, stooped figure stood beside it. Beatrice paused. The woman did not belong here. She wore a charcoal wool pelisse, a decade out of fashion, hem meticulously darned. Her bonnet was plain, unadorned, throwing her face into shadow. She had peeled off one glove and was running her bare, weathered hand over a length of Brussels lace with slow, reverent gentleness, as though greeting an old friend. It was a quiet, private moment. And then Harriet Finch turned around. Harriet had abandoned her debate over gold silk in favor of hunting down a mirror flattering to her profile, and stopped dead when she caught sight of the woman at the remnants table. A look of theatrical disgust swept across her face. "What," Harriet demanded, loud enough to still the whole shop, "is that doing in here?" The nervous shop assistant, pins bristling from her mouth, went pale as milk. "Miss Finch, does Madame Valerius now cater to the workhouse?" Harriet took a mincing step forward, dragging her skirts tight against her legs as if the old woman's mere presence might transmit some contagion. "Or did somebody leave the servants' entrance ajar?" The old woman did not flinch. She turned her head slowly, fixing Harriet with a look from beneath the brim of her plain black bonnet. "I am merely looking at the lace, young lady." Her voice was raspy and dry as autumn leaves, but remarkably steady. "You are touching it!" Harriet snapped, color flooding her cheeks with the particular outrage of a girl who had never once, in her whole gilded life, been told no. "With bare, filthy hands, you'll ruin the weave. Look at you. You couldn't afford a single inch of that lace if you saved for a decade." Mrs. Finch, drawn by the pitch of her daughter's voice, arrived at a brisk clip, her nose wrinkled as though she had discovered something rotten beneath the floorboard. "Good heavens, Harriet, step away. The woman likely has fleas." She snapped her fingers at the frozen assistant.
Remove this vagrant at once. We are spending a fortune in this establishment, and I will not have my daughter breathing the same air as a common beggar." The shop went utterly silent. A dozen fashionable women watched from behind their fans, and not one of them moved. It was the cardinal rule of their class: never intervene in another woman's tantrum. Frightfully poor form. Beatrice felt the familiar hot prickle climb the back of her neck. She looked at the old woman, thin shoulders squared, still holding fast to the edge of the Brussels lace, standing with no trace of fear, only a deep and settled weariness. Beatrice set down her bolt of green velvet. She crossed the shop floor in 4 long strides, unhurried. Hurrying betrayed panic, and panic was for people who feared they might lose.
She walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of a woman at ease in her own authority, an authority she rarely bothered to use, but which was, in this moment, extremely convenient. "Miss Finch?" Her voice was not loud. It carried, all the same, a cold resonance that made Harriet startle. Harriet spun round, and when she registered that the interruption came from nobody grander than Beatrice Hastings, spinster, modest dowry, of no particular consequence, her expression curdled. "Miss Hastings, this does not concern you." "You're right, it does not." Beatrice came to a stop beside the old woman. She was several inches taller than Harriet, an advantage she almost never used, but was, at present, deeply grateful for. "However, your volume is giving me a headache, and I find your manners genuinely offensive." A collective gasp rippled through the corners of the room. Mrs. Finch puffed up like an affronted pigeon. "How dare you? My daughter is merely pointing out that a beggar has infiltrated a respectable establishment." "A beggar?" Beatrice turned, conversationally, to study the old woman. Up close, the fraying at the coat's edges was plain to see, but the wool, though old, was scrupulously clean. And the eyes beneath that dreadful bonnet, when they caught the light, were a startling, piercing blue. Bright, intelligent, faintly, dangerously amused. Beatrice returned her attention to Harriet. "I see no beggar, Miss Finch. I see an elderly woman admiring a piece of lace."
"What I do see is a young woman conducting herself with all the grace and dignity of a cornered badger." Harriet's mouth fell open. You cannot speak to me that way. I am a Finch." "Your father earned his fortune in shipping, if I recall correctly," Beatrice said, smooth as poured cream. "A respectable trade, which makes it all the more baffling that you carry on as though you were born wearing a crown rather than delivered into the world clutching a ledger. Wealth, Miss Finch, can buy you a gold silk gown. It cannot, apparently, purchase you a scrap of common decency." "Get her out," Mrs. Finch shrieked at the assistant. "Throw them both out. I shall take my custom to Madame Celeste." "You are welcome to," Beatrice said, stepping slightly in front of the old woman, a small human shield against the Finch's venom. "Though I hear Madame Celeste requires her clientele to possess a modicum of class. You may find the entrance requirements rather steep." Harriet looked for a moment as though she might weep from pure fury. She opened her mouth, shut it, and finally settled on a look of pure loathing. "You will regret this, Beatrice Hastings. You are a nobody, a dried-up spinster who will die alone."
Do not imagine society will fail to hear how you chose gutter trash over your betters.
"If you are my better, Miss Finch," Beatrice said softly, her eyes gone flat, "then I welcome the grave." Harriet whirled on her heel, skirts cracking like a whip, and swept toward the door with her mother scattering assistance in her wake. The bell above the entrance shrieked as the glass door slammed shut behind them. The silence that followed was thick and strange. Every other patron in the shop suddenly discovered a fascinating interest in gloves and ribbon, determined to pretend they had not just witnessed a small execution. Beatrice let out a long breath and felt the rush of nerve begin to ebb, leaving her hands faintly unsteady. She hated making scenes. She hated the weight of eyes. "Well," said a dry, raspy voice beside her, "that was remarkably vicious." Beatrice turned. The old woman had not moved an inch. She still held the length of Brussels lace, and she looked up at Beatrice with those startling blue eyes and a faint, crooked smile tugging at her thin mouth. "I apologize," Beatrice said, her voice softening. "I fear I have a terrible temper where bullies are concerned. Are you all right, madam?" "I am well." The old woman glanced down at the lace in her hand. though I fear I have caused a disruption, and the young harridan was not wholly wrong.
I cannot afford this lace. Beatrice looked at the delicate spiderweb pattern of the fabric. It is meant to be admired, she said gently. Madame Valerius leaves the offcuts out for inspiration. I used to make lace, the old woman murmured, thumb tracing its edge. A long time ago. She lifted her bare hand, the knuckles swollen, the fingers slightly twisted with age. My hands no longer obey me. I merely wish to feel the quality again. Something in Beatrice's chest pulled tight. There was a quiet, unbroken dignity in the old woman that made her ache. The world, particularly the London world, ground people to dust so casually, so thoughtlessly. It is beautiful work, Beatrice said. She glanced toward the counter, where the shop assistant still watched them with wide, frightened eyes, then reached into her reticule and drew out her small leather purse. Her pin money was not generous. Her father's estate was heavily entailed, and her brother kept a tight fist, but it would be enough. How much for this piece? She called to the assistant. The girl blinked. Oh, miss, that is an offcut. We generally ask 5 shillings. It was a lie, and a poor one. 5 shillings for Brussels lace of that quality was practically theft in the buyer's favor, but the girl was plainly terrified of Beatrice after the dressing-down she'd just delivered. Beatrice crossed to the counter, set down a shining half-sovereign, and waved away the change.
She wrapped the lace carefully in tissue and returned to the old woman. Here, she held out the small, rustling package. The old woman studied it, then looked up, white brows drawing together. I cannot accept charity, child. It is not charity. Beatrice's voice was firm, though her eyes stayed kind. It is an apology on behalf of my entire miserable generation. Use it to mend something, or keep it in a drawer to look at now and then. Only do not let that wretched girl's voice be the last thing you remember of this afternoon. The old woman studied Beatrice's face for a long, quiet moment, an unsettling gaze, as though she were peeling back skin to examine the machinery beneath. Slowly, her gnarled hand closed around the package. You are a strange girl, she said softly. Beatrice laughed, a short, genuine sound. So my family reminds me constantly. You had better slip out before Madame Valerius discovers what I actually paid for that lace and has me arrested for theft. The old woman chuckled, a dusty, wheezing sound, warm despite itself. I will take my leave. Thank you, Miss Hastings. Beatrice Hastings. Miss Hastings. The old woman gave a slight, strangely elegant nod at odds with her frayed wool coat.
I suspect we shall meet again. Beatrice watched her turn and make her slow way toward the door, leaning on a plain wooden cane she had not noticed before, favoring one leg with a faint limp. "Bee!" Louise's voice hissed from behind the dressing screen. Beatrice sighed and turned away from the door. Her sister emerged in the finished muslin, radiant and oblivious to the small war that had just been waged and won in the middle of the shop floor. "Did I hear shouting?" Louisa asked, twitching a sleeve into place. "Only Harriet Finch discovering that the world does not revolve around her," Beatrice said dryly. "A painful epiphany. Turn round. Let me see the back." 20 minutes later, the muslin was ordered, the bill dispatched to their brother's solicitor, and Beatrice was more than ready to go home, draw the curtains, and lie down with a cool cloth over her eyes. The bell chimed as the Hastings sisters stepped onto the pavement. The afternoon sun slanted low across Bond Street, and carriages clattered over the cobbles. Beatrice was drawing on her gloves when she noticed a commotion farther down the street. Traffic had stopped entirely. A massive black lacquered carriage, drawn by 4 matched midnight geldings, blocked the intersection. A vehicle built to intimidate, no crest needed. Pedestrians slowed to stare, whispering behind gloved hands. Beatrice squinted against the sun.
Standing on the curb, close by that intimidating carriage, was the old woman in the gray coat, small and oddly vulnerable against the great gleaming wheels. Beatrice's protective instinct flared at once. Was she lost? Was the driver harassing her? "Wait here," she told Louisa, who was too absorbed fixing her bonnet in a shop window to notice. Beatrice hurried down the pavement, weaving through pedestrians, just as the door of the black carriage swung open. The man who stepped down did not belong on a bustling London street. He belonged in a Gothic novel, or at the head of a cavalry charge. He was tall, impossibly tall, his shoulders cut flawlessly into a dark superfine coat. His black hair swept back from a harsh, aristocratic face, high cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from granite. He was terrifyingly handsome, and his expression, at present, was one of cold, murderous fury.
"I told you to wait at the corner," he snapped at the footman holding the door, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried clear over the street noise. A strange shiver ran down Beatrice's spine at the sound of it. "Apologies, Your Grace," the footman stammered, bowing so low he nearly scraped the paving stones. "The traffic, Your Grace." A duke. Beatrice froze 10 paces off, breath caught, as the terrifying giant of a man turned his dark, furious gaze from the footman toward the curb, toward the old woman in her frayed gray wool. Beatrice braced herself. If he raised his voice at her, duke or not, she was fully prepared to strike him with her parasol. He did not shout. The cold fury drained from his face, replaced by an expression of profound, exasperated affection. He crossed to the old woman and took her gently by the elbows with 2 enormous gloved hands. "Mother." The Duke of Ashbourne's sigh softened into something startlingly tender. "What did we agree about you wandering off without a footman? And why in God's name are you wearing that hideous coat? It smells of mothballs and despair." The old woman, the Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne, smacked her son lightly on the arm with her cane. "Oh, hush, Leo. It keeps the sycophants away. If I dress in my silks, I cannot take 2 steps without some mother shoving her simpering daughter into my path." "You are going to give my steward a heart attack. He thought I'd been kidnapped." The Duke's gaze dropped to the small tissue paper package in her hands. "What is that?" Agatha, the Dowager Duchess, looked down at the Brussels lace and let a slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across her wrinkled face. "A gift," she said softly, sharp blue eyes lifting from the parcel to scan the crowd. "From a most remarkable young woman." Beatrice stood frozen, her heart slamming against her ribs like something trying to escape. "Mother, Your Grace, Leo." She had berated the daughter of a shipping magnate to defend the mother of the most powerful, most notoriously ruthless duke in England. She had given charity to a woman who owned half of Derbyshire. Agatha's gaze found her at last. The old woman's smile widened, and she lifted her gnarled hand, still clutching the little package, in a small, deliberate wave. The Duke, following his mother's line of sight, turned his head, and Beatrice found herself pinned beneath a stare so intense it felt almost physical. His eyes were a stormy, impossible gray. He did not look at her the way the rest of the Tom looked at her, through her, past her, towards someone more useful.
He looked at her, the flushed cheeks, the wide eyes, the white-knuckled grip on her parasol, and for one long second, the whole bustling street fell utterly silent, the world narrowing to the small stretch of pavement between them. Then panic won. Beatrice spun on her heel, seized her skirts, and fled. "Bee!" Louisa yelped as her sister grabbed her arm and towed her bodily down the street. "What on earth? You're wrinkling my sleeve." "We are walking," Beatrice gasped, her face on fire. "Very fast. We are never returning to Bond Street. I am joining a convent in France." Back beside the carriage, Leopold watched the fleeing woman with one dark eyebrow raised, a silent question to his mother. "Her name," Agatha said smoothly, letting her son hand her up into the carriage's plush velvet interior, "is Miss Beatrice Hastings. And Leo, darling," she settled herself with a small, satisfied rustle as he climbed in after her and pulled the door shut. "Cancel our return to the country. I believe we shall be staying in town for the remainder of the season." The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, borne on a silver salver by a footman whose livery cost more than Beatrice's yearly clothing allowance. Thick cream vellum, a wax seal stamped with a roaring lion, sitting in the cramped morning room like an unexploded shell. Richard had paused mid-bite of his toast, a crumb on his lip. He was a man who calculated the value of every interaction before he spoke. At present, his brain had plainly short-circuited. "The Duke of Ashbourne," Richard said, uttering the name the way one utters a prayer inside a crumbling church. "He is hosting a ball on Friday." Louisa snatched the heavy card off the salver, scanning the elegant script. "It's addressed to the whole family, Richard. All of us, even Bea." Beatrice sipped her lukewarm tea without a grimace. "I assure you I have no desire to attend. You and Louisa may go and represent the family's interests well without me." "Don't be absurd." Richard tossed his napkin onto the table, suddenly animated.
You will go. Ashbourne has not opened his London house in 5 years. The man practically lives in a cave in Derbyshire. If he is hosting, it means he is looking, and every family with an unmarried daughter under 30 will be clawing for the altar. Which is precisely why I ought not to go, Beatrice said gently. I am 26. I am not clawing anywhere. I would rather stay home with the parliamentary reports. At least the politicians are honest about their lying. You are going, Richard said, tone final. We need the social capital. Being seen at Ashbourne House elevates this family. Besides, Louisa requires a chaperone while I am networking. Beatrice looked out the window at a sky the color of dirty slate.
She knew well why that invitation had arrived, and it had nothing to do with Richard's imaginary influence or Louise's pretty face. It had everything to do with a scrap of Brussels lace and a frail woman in a frayed gray coat. I suspect we shall meet again. The Dowager Duchess's words echoed in her mind, sharp as a winter branch. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. By Thursday, the ton hummed with frantic energy. Modistes worked their seamstresses to exhaustion. The rumor mill churned out elaborate theories, the most popular, loudly broadcast by Mrs. Finch, holding that the Duke had glimpsed Harriet through the shop window and thrown open his London house purely to secure an introduction. She is insufferable, Louisa had whispered, watching Harriet preen beside the pianoforte. She is terrified, Beatrice corrected quietly. Loud people usually are. If she ever stops declaring her triumph inevitable, she might have to consider failure. On Friday evening, before her narrow bedroom mirror, Beatrice prepared for the slaughter. She refused a new gown, choosing instead her darkest, least conspicuous dress, a deep plum silk that seemed to swallow candlelight rather than reflect it. No jewelry, save a strand of seed pearls that had belonged to her mother. You look as though you're attending a fashionable funeral, Louisa observed from the doorway, resplendent in spun sugar pink. I am, Beatrice said, turning from the glass. The funeral of my quiet, uninterrupted life. Let us get this over with. Ashbourne House did not occupy its corner of the square, it dominated it. A vast block of Portland stone, windows ablaze with 1,000 candles, the line of carriages stretching around the corner and out of sight. Inside, the ballroom was suffocating, crushed orchids, hot wax, nervous perspiration beneath layers of French perfume. A string orchestra played from the gallery, nearly drowned beneath the roar of 300 people, each trying to sound more important than the last. Beatrice executed her survival protocol, steering Louisa toward a cluster of potted palms by the terrace doors, a clear view of the room with a physical barrier against the crowd. Richard vanished within 3 minutes, drawn helplessly toward a knot of elderly lords like a moth toward flame. It is magnificent, Louisa breathed, eyes wide on the gilded ceiling and the massive crystal chandeliers. It is loud, Beatrice said, scanning the floor. The social order was laid out with startling clarity, minor gentry hugging the walls, wealthy merchants clustered hopefully near the refreshments, and near the grand staircase, the apex predators. Harriet Finch stood among them in her gold silk, a stunning gown, cut daringly low, draped to perfection, surrounded by her mother and a small chorus of admirers, her eyes darting constantly toward the empty landing above, waiting for her Duke. Beatrice retreated another step, letting a large fern's shadow fall across her face. 3 hours. She only had to survive 3 hours, and then she could go home, remove her shoes, and pretend none of it had happened. Then all silence rolled across the room, not sudden, but spreading, a wave that killed every conversation in its path as it moved outward from the grand staircase. At the top of the stairs stood Leopold, Duke of Ashbourne, in stark, severe evening black. No medals, no ribbons, none of it necessary. His sheer physical presence commanded the room outright. He surveyed the sea of expectant faces below with an expression of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He did not look like a man in search of a bride. He looked like a man evaluating a room full of cattle. Beside him stood the Dowager Duchess, and Beatrice's breath caught outright. Agatha was transformed, the frayed gray wool and dreadful bonnet gone, replaced by a gown of heavy midnight blue velvet that swallowed the candlelight whole.
At her throat sat a sapphire the size of a quail's egg, ringed in diamonds that scattered light across the walls. She leaned on her wooden cane, but her spine was iron straight. She looked every inch a queen surveying a mildly disappointing kingdom. The pair began their descent. The crowd parted, pressing themselves flat against the walls to clear a wide path. Harriet Finch stepped forward, right to the edge of the human corridor, arranging herself into a bright, practiced smile. Mrs. Finch vibrated with anticipation just behind her.
Leopold reached the floor and began to walk. He did not glance at the women flinging themselves into his line of sight. He did not acknowledge the deep bows of the men. His stormy gray eyes swept the room's perimeter, past the gilded mirrors, past the ice sculptures, past Harriet Finch, whose bright smile faltered as he strode past without so much as a blink in her direction. He was walking toward the potted palms. Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She took an instinctive step back and struck the plaster wall with her heel. "Don't look at me. Walk past. Please, God, keep walking." He did not. The crowd parted ahead of him, leaving a clean, painfully empty stretch of floor between the Duke of Ashbourne and Beatrice Hastings. He stopped a few feet away. Up close, the harsh planes of his face were even more pronounced, a faint shadow of stubble along his jaw suggesting he despised his valet nearly as much as he despised this party. He looked down at her. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the spinster in the plum dress. "Miss Hastings," his voice, low and resonant, carried through the hush. Beatrice sank into a flawless mechanical curtsy, her mind racing for some means of deflection. "Your Grace," she said, keeping her eyes fixed on the silver buckles of his shoes. "Look at me." It was not a request. It was spoken softly, but with absolute authority. Beatrice straightened and met his gaze. His eyes were not cold, merely aggressively observant, dissecting her exactly as his mother had done outside the modiste's shop. "My mother informs me," he said, pitched to carry to the nearest listeners, "that I owe a debt to a woman in a dress shop. She tells me this woman defended a stranger against a remarkably vicious attack from a young lady with rather more money than sense." A sharp collective intake of breath rippled outward from the center of the room. Harriet Finch let out a strangled squeak. Leopold did not break his gaze. "I assumed my mother was exaggerating. She enjoys drama. I see now she was understating the matter considerably." "I merely spoke out of turn, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice tight but steady. "It is a flaw I am regularly reminded of." "Is it?" The corner of his mouth twitched, a fraction of a millimeter. "I find it remarkably efficient. You cut straight through the rot to reach the timber beneath, a rare trait in this city." He held out his hand, large, gloved in white silk. "They are playing a waltz, Miss Hastings, and my mother has threatened to beat me with her cane if I do not dance with you." Beatrice stared at the offered hand. This was a public execution dressed up as a courtesy. If she took it, she would carry a target on her back for the rest of her natural life. The ton would tear her to pieces, and Harriet Finch would likely hire an assassin. She looked up at his face and saw exactly what he was doing, forcing her out of the shadows, deliberately, with no malice in it, only a quiet, demanding challenge. "Are you brave enough?" Beatrice let out a slow breath and placed her gloved hand in his. "I should hate for your Grace to suffer a bruising on my account," she said flatly. Leopold's fingers closed around hers, warm and grounding. "You are kind. Come, let us go ruin your reputation." He did not lead her straight to the center of the floor. He walked at a measured pace, forcing the crowd to fall back and give them room. The orchestra, which had faltered during his approach, hastily picked the waltz back up. When they finally took their places, he drew her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed. Not an intimacy, but a barricade, insulating them from the hundreds of eyes pressing in from every direction. "You are stiff, Miss Hastings," he noted, sweeping her into the first turn. His movements were precise, powerful, without effort. He did not so much dance as pilot the floor, a captain steering a warship down a narrow channel. "I am terrified, Your Grace," Beatrice replied honestly, voice low.
There are women in this room currently calculating how best to poison my tea. I can feel them staring at the back of my neck. Leopold let out a short, rough laugh, as though the sound came rusty from disuse. Let them stare. They are vultures, and vultures only pick at things already dead or dying. You, Miss Hastings, are very much alive." "I was content being dead to society," she countered, matching his steps. "Invisibility is a highly underrated survival tactic." "Invisibility is a coward's tactic," he corrected smoothly, "and you are no coward. A coward does not humiliate an heiress in public to protect a stranger."
Beatrice glanced past his shoulder. "I did not know she was a duchess. Had I known—" "Had you known what?" he prompted, turning them past a cluster of shocked dowagers. "Would you have walked away? Let Miss Finch finish her tirade?" "No," Beatrice admitted, jaw tightening, "but I wouldn't have handed her a half-sovereign out of pity. That was appallingly patronizing of me." "My mother," Leopold said, his tone warming into something proud, "owns rubies that Catherine the Great once tried to purchase. That piece of lace you gave her sits on her vanity table beside her hairbrushes. She has not stopped speaking of it for 3 days. She dresses down in London to discover who will treat her with decency once the title and the money are stripped away. A cynical little game. Most seasons she goes the whole length of it without finding a single person who passes the test." His dark eyes locked on hers. "Until Tuesday." "You do not care for the ton either," Beatrice observed, stating it as fact rather than question. "I loathe it," Leopold said without hesitation. "A marketplace where human beings are weighed, priced, and traded for land and influence. Yet here you are," Beatrice pointed out, "hosting the largest market of the year." "My mother required a stage," he said, spinning her, the plum silk of her skirts flaring against his black trousers.
"She wished to demonstrate to London what actual grace looks like, and to humiliate the Finches for their vulgarity. And mostly," his grip tightened fractionally at her waist, "she wished to see what you would do once dragged into the light." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "I am not a performing monkey, Your Grace, nor a pawn in your mother's games." "I know. If I thought you were, I would have sent a bouquet and a polite note of thanks, and left you to your precious invisibility." The music swelled towards its final bars. Leopold slowed their steps, drawing them to a stop at the edge of the floor, and held her a second longer than strictly necessary. "You are angry," he noted quietly. "I am annoyed," Beatrice corrected, stepping back into a sharp curtsy. "I do not care for being manipulated, even by duchesses." "Good." A dangerous, fascinating gleam lit his eye. "Keep that anger, Miss Hastings. You will need it." Before she could ask what on earth he meant, he offered a stiff, formal bow and turned away, vanishing into the crowd toward the card rooms. Beatrice stood alone at the edge of the dance floor, stripped of every armor she owned, when a shadow fell across her path. The Dowager Duchess had materialized from the crowd, leaning on her cane, the sapphire at her throat glittering violently in the candlelight. "Well done, my dear," Agatha rasped, sharp blue eyes crinkling. "You did not step on his toes once." "Your Grace," Beatrice said, guarded, "your son informs me I am part of a demonstration." Agatha laughed, dry, dusty. "My son lacks tact. He believes everything is a cavalry charge. I apologize if we have overwhelmed you. May I call you Beatrice?" "You may call me whatever you wish, Your Grace. You appear to dictate reality in this room." "A sharp tongue. Excellent." Agatha tapped her cane against the floor. "Walk with me, child. Let us go to the supper room. Standing about only invites tedious conversation, and I have no wish to speak with you while Mrs. Finch attempts to throw her daughter under my feet." Beatrice had little choice. She offered her arm, and the Duchess took it, her gnarled grip surprisingly strong. The crowd parted for them, a red sea of silk and broadcloth. Beatrice kept her chin high, refusing to meet the staring faces. She had spent 6 years fading carefully into the background. In the span of a single 10-minute dance, mother and son had dragged her onto the center stage, pressed a script into her hands that she had never read, and locked the doors behind her. The game had changed entirely, and she had not the faintest idea of the new rules. The supper room was a masterpiece of intimidation dressed up as hospitality, long tables groaning beneath roasted meats and out-of-season fruit, the atmosphere tense as a courtroom awaiting a verdict.
Agatha bypassed the main tables entirely, steering them toward a small, secluded alcove draped in gold velvet and guarded by 2 footmen who looked more like hired muscle than domestic staff. "Sit," Agatha commanded, lowering herself into a plush armchair with a weary sigh, propping her cane against the table. "My knees are staging a violent rebellion." Beatrice took the opposite chair, arranging her plum skirts, keenly aware of the dozens of eyes attempting to pierce the velvet drapery. A footman appeared, pouring a clear, fragrant broth into 2 porcelain bowls. "I detest ballroom food," Agatha said, taking up her spoon. "Entirely designed for display rather than digestion. Eat, Beatrice. It will settle your stomach." Beatrice obliged. The broth was hot, richly flavored with chicken and thyme, and it grounded her, pulling her back from the surreal ledge she had been teetering on since Leopold took her hand. "You are quiet," Agatha observed. "I am currently attempting to determine whether I am a guest or a hostage, Your Grace." Agatha barked a laugh. "A fair question. You are a guest, I assure you, though I understand why you feel cornered. Leo is not subtle. He told you that you were part of a demonstration. He is an idiot." She rolled her eyes, a remarkably unducal gesture. "Men always assume they understand the mechanics of society because they hold the titles. They do not. Society is run by women, Beatrice."
It is a war fought in drawing rooms, waged with invitations and carefully placed slights. Leo believes he can march in, demand honesty, and march out again. He does not understand the fallout. "The fallout," Beatrice said plainly, "is that my family will be surrounded by sycophants by morning, and every woman of consequence in London will spend the next fortnight plotting my ruin." "Yes," Agatha agreed, blue eyes sharp. "Are you frightened?" Beatrice considered the question honestly. She thought of Richard's inevitable, suffocating ambition. She thought of Harriet Finch's venom. She looked across at the old woman before her, who wore her immense power with an air of complete, unapologetic exhaustion. "No," Beatrice said softly, "I am not frightened. I am merely tired. I spent 6 years building a quiet life. I liked my quiet life." Something in Agatha's expression softened, the sharp, cynical edges of the Dowager Duchess melting away to reveal an old woman who looked, suddenly, deeply and profoundly lonely. "My husband, the late Duke, loved the noise," she murmured, tracing the rim of her bowl, "loved the sycophants, loved the endless, meaningless chatter. When he died, Leo inherited the title, the debts, and the vultures. He was 22. He spent 10 years repairing the estate, mending his father's messes, learning to despise the people who praised him to his face, was quietly waiting for him to fail." Beatrice sat silent, absorbing the weight of it.
"He needs a wife," Agatha continued, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Not a girl who faints when he raises his voice. Not a woman who tallies her affection against the balance of his ledgers. He needs someone unafraid of the dark, Beatrice. Someone who will stand in a crowded shop and tell a bully to go to the devil." Before Beatrice could begin to process the enormity of what was being implied, the velvet curtain was drawn back. Mrs. Finch stood there, gripping a pale, trembling Harriet by the arm. The gold silk suddenly looked heavy and absurd on her. "Your Grace," Mrs. Finch said, sinking into a curtsy so deep she nearly toppled over. "I do apologize for the intrusion. We had to pay our respects." Agatha did not look up from her broth. "You are interrupting my supper, Mrs. Finch." "I am so terribly sorry." Mrs. Finch's face flushed a dull, panicked red as she shoved Harriet forward. "Harriet wished to apologize for Tuesday. We did not realize who you were, Your Grace." "Ah," Agatha set down her spoon at last and leveled a gaze of pure ice at the pair. "You did not realize I was a duchess, and that, of course, alters the mathematics of your cruelty. Had I truly been a penniless old woman, your daughter's behavior would have been acceptable." Harriet flinched as though struck. "Your Grace, Do not speak to me," Agatha snapped, and the sheer authority in her voice dropped the temperature of the little alcove several degrees. "You are a vulgar, cruel little girl who judges the world by its wrapping, because you possess nothing whatsoever of substance underneath. I have no interest in your apology. It is motivated by terror, not regret." Mrs. Finch looked ready to burst into tears. "Your Grace, please, my husband's standing..." "Your husband's standing is not my concern." Agatha gestured toward Beatrice, who sat still. "If you wish to apologize to anyone, apologize to Miss Hastings. She was the one forced to endure your screeching." Both Finches turned to stare at Beatrice. The prospect of apologizing to a spinster of modest dowry was viscerally agonizing. It upended their entire understanding of the world. Beatrice looked at Harriet and saw, beneath the panic and the humiliation, something close to genuine desperation, a girl clinging to her rung on a ladder that could snap at any moment. 6 years earlier, Beatrice might have felt a spark of vindictive pleasure. Now she felt only pity. It was a wretched way to live. "That will not be necessary," Beatrice said gently, breaking the heavy silence. Agatha frowned. "Beatrice, do not let them off the hook." "There is no hook, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, eyes still on Harriet. "An apology extracted under threat of social ruin is worth precisely nothing. I do not want it."
"Miss Finch and I understand one another well. Let us leave it there." She turned to the girl directly. "You may go." Mrs. Finch grabbed her daughter's arm, dropped another hasty, awkward curtsy, and half-dragged Harriet from the alcove, the velvet curtain swinging shut behind them. Harriet, in the last instant before she vanished, looked back at Beatrice with an expression of pure, bewildered relief. Agatha sighed and picked her spoon back up. "You are too merciful." "Mercy requires power, Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice flat. "I have none. I merely decline to take part in their degradation. It is exhausting." "It is," a deep voice agreed from the shadows just beyond the alcove. The curtain drew back, and Leopold stepped in. He looked first to his mother, then to Beatrice, his stormy gray eyes fixing on her entirely. He had evidently watched the whole exchange. "The carriage is ready, Mother. The orchestra is playing its final set. Our guests will begin departing shortly." Agatha smiled, slow and thoroughly satisfied, and reached for her cane. "Excellent. I have had enough of this circus. Miss Hastings, it has been a profound pleasure sharing supper with you." Beatrice stood and dropped a polite curtsy. "Your Grace." Leopold stepped aside to let her mother pass, and then it was only the two of them, alone in the dim gold light of the alcove. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, merely heavy, weighted with things unsaid.
"You did not gloat," Leopold observed, stepping closer. "Gloating is for those surprised by their own victories," Beatrice said, looking up at him. "I did not win anything tonight, Your Grace. I merely survived it." He reached out. For an instant she thought he meant to touch her face. Instead, his warm, gloved hand brushed lightly against the fabric of her sleeve. "I will call on you Monday, Miss Hastings," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of absolute intent. "My brother will be thoroughly unbearable," Beatrice warned, her heart executing a slow, heavy thud. "I do not care about your brother." He stepped back, the candlelight catching the harsh angles of his face. "Good night, Beatrice." He did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, leaving her standing alone in the alcove amid cold supper and the dawning, terrifying realization that her quiet life was, officially, over. Saturday morning tasted of cold tea and raw panic. The Hastings household had descended into chaos. Richard had staggered home from Ashbourne House at 3 a.m, buzzing with manic energy. By 8 he had summoned the modiste, the solicitor, and half the tailors in Mayfair. Beatrice sat at the breakfast table staring at a piece of dry toast, while Richard paced the length of the dining room, hands clasped behind his back. "He danced with you," Richard said, for perhaps the 10th time.
He bypassed 3 other daughters, the Finch heiress, Lady Mary, to dance with you. And then the Dowager took you to supper. The Dowager Duchess Beatrice, the woman is a dragon, and she shared her soup with you." "It was broth, Richard," Beatrice said tiredly. "It does not matter if it was poisoned water. It was a public endorsement." He stopped pacing and leaned across the table, eyes wide and feverish. "Do you understand the leverage this gives us? When he calls, and he will call, you must be agreeable. Agree with his opinions, laugh at his jokes." "I will not," Beatrice said. Richard blinked. "What do you mean you will not?" "I mean precisely that. I will not simper. I will not laugh at jokes that are not funny. I will not pretend to be a porcelain doll." She pushed her plate away and rose. "If the Duke of Ashbourne wanted a sycophant, he had a ballroom full to choose from on Friday. If he calls on me, he will have me, nothing more, nothing less. You are throwing away the greatest opportunity this family has had in a century." Richard shouted, his face going purple. and you will ruin it with your stubborn spinsterish pride. My pride, Richard, Beatrice shot back, her voice deadly calm, is the only thing I actually own. You control the estate. You control my dowry. You control where I live.
You do not control my character. She turned and walked out of the dining room, ignoring Louisa's wide-eyed stare from the doorway. She needed air. She needed quiet. 10 minutes later, dressed plainly, she slipped out the back of the townhouse toward a small, unfashionable park a few streets over. No gravel paths, no ornamental lakes, just ancient gnarled oaks and wild grass. The morning air bit sharply. Beatrice breathed it in deep, letting the cold scour the Leopold's dark eyes, fog of her brother's ambition from her lungs, and walked until her mind went blank, refusing to think of Boulder or the certainty in his voice when he had said her name. You walk exactly as you dance. Beatrice froze, then turned. Leopold stepped out from beneath the shadow of a massive oak, dressed not in the severe black of the ballroom, but in a heavy riding coat of dark blue wool, tall boots splashed with mud, his cravat loosely tied. He looked rougher, more dangerous, out of place in this small London park. Do you make a habit of stalking women in public parks, Your Grace? Only when they flee their own homes at 9 in the morning. He closed the distance between them and stopped a respectful few feet off. Your footman was easily bribed. He mentioned you favor this square when you wish to avoid your brother. Beatrice scowled. Remind me to dismiss him. Don't. He was merely looking after his own livelihood. He knows I could buy this entire street if I wished it. Leopold pushed his bare hands deep into his coat pockets. He looked exhausted, the shadows beneath his eyes stark in the harsh daylight. Why are you here, Your Grace? Beatrice asked softly. You said you would call Monday. This is Saturday.
The ton is likely still asleep, dreaming of new ways to secure your fortune. I am here, he said, his voice a low, graveled rasp, because I realized I made a tactical error last night. Beatrice's chest went tight. Here it comes, the retreat, the sober second thought, the quiet realization that a spinster was not worth the scandal. She braced for the dismissal. A tactical error? Yes. He drew his hands from his pockets, and in his right he held a small, familiar tissue paper package. He held it out to her. Beatrice looked down at it. Brussels lace. My mother asked me to return this to you, he said. A cold, hollow feeling spread through her stomach. She had been right, after all. It was over before it had ever properly begun. She reached out and took the package, her gloved fingers brushing his, and looked away, out over a patch of muddy grass. I see, she said quietly. The Dowager's demonstration has concluded. The point has been made. I am to take my charity back and resume my invisibility. Look at me, Beatrice. He gave the command. She snapped her head up, eyes flashing with sudden defensive anger. Do not speak to me as though I were one of your servants, Your Grace.
You've had your amusement. I am returning the lace, he interrupted, voice rising, drowning her anger under sheer desperate intensity. Because my mother told me that if I want you, I must earn you myself. I cannot use her gratitude as a bridge to get there. Beatrice stopped breathing entirely. She stared at him, the small package crushed in her fist. He took a step closer. The air between them seemed to crackle. I spent 10 years fixing a broken estate, Beatrice. 10 years surrounded by people who see me as nothing more than a bank vault with a title attached to it. I am tired of the artifice. I am tired of the lies. His stormy eyes stripped away every defense she had carefully built over 6 long years. I saw you in that shop, he continued, voice dropping to something near a whisper. I saw a woman with more courage, more raw and unvarnished decency in her smallest finger than the entire peerage combined. You stood between a predator and its prey, and you did not flinch. I do not want a porcelain doll. I do not want a political alliance. I want a partner. Beatrice swallowed hard, feeling the cynical armor she wore begin to crack under the weight of his terrifying honesty. I am not a romantic, am sharp-tongued.
I will likely irritate you on a daily basis. I am counting on it, Leopold said, a shadow of a smile touching his mouth. A quiet house would drive me mad. My brother will try to exploit you. I will crush him financially if he attempts it. It will take roughly 3 minutes. Beatrice let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and looked down at the lace in her hand, then up again at the towering, formidable man standing in the mud before her. You are offering a strange bargain, Leopold, she said, using his Christian name for the first time. His eyes darkened at the sound of it. I am offering you the truth, Beatrice. No games, no societal mechanics. A life in which you never again have to hide in the corners, unless you wish to, in which case we shall hide together. He did not press her for an answer. He took her hand, pressed a firm, warm kiss to the back of her glove, and stepped away. I will call Monday, he said softly, to ask your brother's permission. Be prepared to catch him when he faints. He turned and walked off into the morning mist, leaving Beatrice alone beneath the great oak.
She looked down at the lace in her hand, the small physical proof of a single act of kindness that had, by accident, altered the entire course of her life, folded the tissue carefully, tucked it into her pocket, and began the walk home. For the first time in 6 years, Beatrice Hastings did not look down at the pavement as she walked. She looked straight ahead. Monday afternoon arrived like an executioner. Richard paced the Persian rug in the front parlor, boots carving a frantic trench into the wool, reeking of bay rum and raw anxiety. Louisa sat frozen on the sofa. Beatrice stood by the window in a plain green day dress, methodically turning the pages of a book she was not reading. When the brass knocker cracked at last against the front door, Richard stopped breathing entirely. Leopold walked in, stripping off his leather gloves, bypassing the customary pleasantries entirely, his sheer physical presence stealing the oxygen from the room. Richard launched into a deep, groveling bow. Your Grace, a profound honor. Shall we repair to my study to discuss settlements? No. The word landed like a lead weight. Richard blinked, his greedy smile faltering. I beg your pardon? The dowry. I don't want your sister's dowry. Leopold's voice was devoid of any warmth whatsoever. I want your signature. You will sign a document waiving any future financial claim upon my estate. I am marrying Beatrice.
I am not funding your political ambitions, and I am not paying your tailor. If you attempt to leverage my name for social or financial gain, I will bankrupt you by Thursday. Do we understand one another? Richard's mouth opened and shut, opened and shut. The grand fantasy of tapping the Ashbourne fortune evaporated in a matter of seconds, leaving nothing behind but terror. I understand. Good. Leopold dismissed him with barely another glance and crossed the room to the window, stopping inches from Beatrice. The intimidating, ruthless Duke vanished in an instant, replaced by the tired, brutally honest man from the park. He reached into his coat and drew out a worn velvet box, which he handed to her, closed. It belonged to my grandmother, he murmured, his attention on her. The Duncan sapphire is far too loud, but she loved my grandfather fiercely, and she never once let another soul dictate her life. I thought it appropriate. Beatrice took the small, heavy box in her hands. She looked up into his stormy gray eyes, tracing the deep lines of exhaustion there. Exhaustion she knew suddenly she could help him carry. He was no fairy tale prince. He was a man holding a fortress alone, offering her a place along the wall. I require my own library, Beatrice said quietly, holding his gaze.
I will not be confined to a drawing room, and I will not tolerate being managed. You shall have the East Wing, Leopold replied smoothly, and the day I attempt to manage you, I expect to be stabbed with a letter opener. A genuine, unpracticed smile broke across Beatrice's face. She placed her free hand in his. Then I accept your bargain, Leopold. He exhaled, a rough, heavy breath, and leaned down until his forehead came briefly to rest against hers, right there, in front of her thoroughly stunned siblings. Thank God, he murmured. Now, let us leave this wretched city. I want to show you the dogs. 3 weeks later, London society received its final shock of the season. There was no grand spectacle at St. George's, Hanover Square.
The Duke of Ashbourne married Beatrice Hastings in a small, draughty stone church in Derbyshire, with only a weeping Louisa, a thoroughly defeated Richard, and the Dowager Duchess in attendance. Agatha stood in the front pew, leaning on her wooden cane, dressed once more in her old, frayed grey wool coat. And as her son kissed his new, stubbornly cynical Duchess, the old woman smiled. The smile of someone who had finally, after a great many disappointing seasons, found the person she'd been looking for.